If everybody would please take their seats, we'll get started. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Tom Donnelly. I work here at AEI as a resident fellow and director of our Center for Defense Studies. Again, I'm just here to welcome everybody, at least for the moment, not only on behalf of AEI, but my partners in crime from the New America Foundation and from the Center for a New American Security. This is a joint project, and multiplying think tank bureaucracies adds geometrical levels of complexities, but we've been working at 3 now for a while, and very pleased to kick off what is a series of events examining the core issues of foreign and national security policy in this presidential year. And though the three of us are obviously institutions with somewhat differing policy perspectives, what's brought us together in this case is a shared belief that this will be an extremely consequential election. Voters may make their choices based on domestic concerns, but the outcome will matter to the world, and the world will be watching America come this November. The series is intended to frame what we've agreed are the 4 principal strategic concerns of our time: the future of the Middle East, the effect of China's geopolitical rise, whether the American military can continue to sustain American global leadership in the years ahead, and really above all and first and foremost today's topic: what role do we see for ourselves in the years ahead? We're very lucky to have Bob Kagan from the Brookings Institution to lead this conversation. Really nobody's thought more deeply about the role of American power than Bob has in recent years. So without further wind-up, let me turn the podium over to our moderator, NPR's Tom Gilton. Tom is not only a very fine and experienced reporter and serious student of international affairs, but he's got the gravitas and the horsemanship to herd this think tank pundit roundup forward into the future. So, Tom, please.
Thank you very much. Maybe I need to push that button, so that's a warning to the rest of you too. And as is the custom, you know, at these events, I guess we have to remind you to silence your cell phones so we don't get interrupted. This is a real pleasure for me to be here, and I'm very impressed by how many of you have shown up on this spectacular spring afternoon, almost a summer afternoon. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, though, because you have a chance to listen to the thoughts of a writer who has given President Obama his main foreign policy talking point for the State of the Union. So I'm not at all surprised that you are anxious to hear him elaborate on his very provocative thesis that the idea that America is declining is actually a myth. A very impressive New Republic article and an even more impressive small book in which he spells that out. So without further ado, I think you all know Bob Kagan from his writings. And one of the things that I think is most impressive about your record, Bob, is that you are not only a pundit, but you actually help advise administrations, and you played a really important role in advising the past administration in Iraq policy, which I hope we can get into a bit as well. But without any further comment, why don't you take it away and tell us what the message that you really wanted to put out with this book was.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for crediting me with so much influence, especially when I was living in Brussels at the time. I consider that to be a truly extraordinary influence. But I would like to just say a few words before we have a terrific panel here. And let me just thank both Toms and thank the organizations who put this together. It's a very important subject, and I do believe this is a consequential election, and it's a consequential election on an issue that is not being talked about very much, which is foreign policy. So it's very important and timely that you guys have pulled this together. It's true that thanks to a certain high-ranking administration official, the aspect of my book that's gotten the most attention is the argument against American decline, but the major thrust of the book is about other things, and mostly it's about the very special world order that we live in today and that has existed since the end of the Second World War, how fragile it is, and how, in my view, dependent it is ultimately on American power. Let me just describe this world order, because I think with all the difficulties that there are in the world today, it's easy to lose sight of how, from any historical perspective, we continue to live in what I think can only be fairly described as a golden age of humanity. And I would say that looking at three fundamental qualities of the international order that we have been enjoying now since, for the better part of the last 7 decades. The first is one of the more obvious, which is the enormous spread of democracy. On the eve of World War II, there were roughly 10 democracies in the world. In 1900, there were arguably 5, however you want to define it. I understand the definitions are complicated. But today, there are over 100. And again, if you think in terms of human history, that is absolutely unprecedented and unique quality. The second thing is the global prosperity that we have enjoyed. It's hard to measure past GDP growth for the world, but some serious economists have tried, and the estimates are that between the years 0 and 1500, global GDP grew on an average of, 0.1% a year. From 1500 to 1950, it may have risen to something like between 1%, maybe around 1% a year. But since 1950, global GDP has grown on average about 4% a year, which we're talking about an entire planet. That is a huge and seismic difference. And one of the remarkable qualities of that economic growth is that it has been global. It has not just been centered in the transatlantic community, but in fact the highest growth rates have occurred outside, and we see the fruits of it all around us with the growth of China, the growth of India, the growth of Brazil, and other rising economies. This is a unique situation, and in the course of this period, 4 billion people have effectively moved out of poverty into some area of the middle class, and that itself is truly extraordinary in human history. Most of human history has been a story of poverty and tyranny and also war. And while there have been no shortage of wars in this period, we have been spared massive great power war, which was, needless to say, a feature of the immediate 50 years prior to the onset of this world order, with 2 world wars in the 20th century. But prior to that as well, the world knew almost constant great power conflict through the 16th, 17th, 18th, and in parts of the 19th century, although there were some periods of peace in the 19th century. These great power conflicts are the kind that kill tens of millions of people, destroy an international system, and we have been spared that. If you take those 3 things together, you realize what an utterly unique period this has been in human history. Most of human history has known poverty, dictatorship, and war. We have, with the difficulties we've had in this period, nevertheless, we have been spared the great power war, the poverty, and the dictatorship to a remarkable extent. The second point is this world order was created substantially by American power, rests on the continued exercise of American power in all its dimensions, military, economic, and political, and will not survive the decline of that power. This world order reflects very much American preferences and proclivities. It is not foreordained. It is not the product of natural human evolution. We have seen democracy fail in the past in history. We have seen liberal economic orders collapse in the past, and we've seen, obviously, wars between great powers break out. It's nothing about our current era is permanent. It relies on the powers that have created it to sustain it, and the most important power in that regard has been the United States. The final question, which is the subject that has gotten more attention, is, well, are we not in fact in decline and incapable of sustaining this, even if it is the right thing to do? My argument is, and we can get into this in discussion, I'm sure, that most of the discussion about American decline is based on a myth. And the number one myth that it's based on is that you often hear it said the United States can no longer do whatever it wants to do, can no longer get nations to do what it wants it to do, can no longer have its way in the world. The myth is that there ever was such a time. If you go back to any decade of the Cold War, beginning with the first, for whatever successes the United States achieved, there were at least equal and in some cases greater failures. From the first decade, when the Chinese Revolution was considered, I think rightly, a tremendous strategic setback of the United States, I could move on to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the oil crisis of the 70s, the fall of the rise of the Iranian Revolution. I could go on and do go on in this lengthy essay. So if you want to get all the details, you can find it there. So most of the notion that we're in decline is based on a myth about the past. If you look at basic measures of power in the international system, the United States, and in those harder to, those less tangible measures of influence, I would say the United States is roughly where it has been in past decades. Unable to do everything it wants, unable to solve the Middle East peace crisis as it has not for the past 40 years, but nevertheless capable of doing quite a bit more, I think, than people think. So let me leave it at that and leave the rest for our discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bob. What we're going to do here now, I'm going to ask Bob a question or two, and then I'm going to invite each of our panelists to ask a question or two. Then we're going to get a little bit of a discussion going among us up here, and then we're going to let you go at Bob. I do want to point out, and echoing what Tom said at the beginning, I think it is impressive that we've got three different think tanks sponsoring this series with sort of three marginally different views of the world, but I don't want to bend too far over in the direction of harmony here. I do hope that we can have a spirited discussion because there are serious policy issues that are being debated, and this actually sets up my first question for you, Bob. I mean, in emphasizing that the position of the United States and the power of the United States has been remarkably consistent through economic crises, through political crises, through different administrations. And yet, on the other hand, you say another thing, which is that this is not foreordained. This could change. So what is it that explains the permanence of this position? And conversely, what matters? I mean, does foreign policy matter? Does presidential leadership matter? What is it that could actually change this if, in fact, we have maintained this position throughout administrations, throughout different ideological perspectives?
Well, it's an excellent question, and you know what can change it is a growing consensus, either that we simply cannot sustain this role anymore, or that we shouldn't sustain this role anymore. And there are certainly spokesmen for all those positions out there. I think that even the president, who made this ringing refutation of decline in his State of the Union address, sometimes encourages the notion that we ought to be, quote unquote, nation building at home, not engaging in all this foreign activity, which I think feeds the notion that it's time for a timeout. And obviously, since we are moving in the current budget crisis toward the possibility of sequestration, which means cuts that this administration believes would be catastrophic, I think that's a word that they've actually used, or certainly words like that, to America's military capabilities overseas. Yeah, if you begin to make, if you make that decision and you stick with it long enough, people don't like to think about the role of American hard power in the world because they think about wars that haven't been successful, but they underestimate how important that hard power is in maintaining this world order. If America has significantly less of it, that will begin to reshape the international system. Now, I am relatively optimistic that that is not where the American people are going to go. I don't think Ron Paul is going to get the Republican nomination, much less the presidency. I think there is a very pretty strong consensus in the country that although we may be having our difficulties now, the United States really should continue to play this role in the world, and I think you'll get it regardless of who's elected.
And does that also explain, Bob, why there has been such continuity in this American position? I mean, despite Republicans and Democrats in the White House, would you say historically there has largely, that consensus has largely been maintained?
That consensus has been maintained since World War II. There was more fluctuation, obviously, in the past because the Americans made a decision after World War I to absent themselves from the international scene as best they could. The major continuities are, one, the belief in the special nature of the United States, which really goes back to the founding and has driven American foreign policy consistently regardless of who's president. The notion that the United States is the keeper of a fundamental truth about which there are no other truths, and that the United States has this special role in the world. The other element has been power. The more power the United States has had, the more it has taken on these responsibilities, despite all the complexities of what that means. And the lesson of World War II, or really the lesson of both world wars, that Americans, in a way, ingested and became part of their psyche, was the world really doesn't work well without us. Now, this notion is constantly challenged and constantly questioned, but I think that that remains a fundamental premise of American thinking about these things.
And one final question before I turn it over. It seems like you are arguing against a kind of zero-sum analysis of the world, because you do talk quite extensively about the rise of the rest, if not the decline of the West, but the rise of the rest, and you say the rest can rise without U.S. position declining. That seems to be a rejection of the zero-sum view of the world.
Yeah, I mean, the rise of the rest needs to be analyzed more specifically. It depends on who's rising. I don't consider the rise of Brazil to cut against American power and influence in the world. And I don't mean that in the sense that Brazil's not significant enough to cut into it. I mean that I think that the rise of Brazil is additive to the world order that America has been supporting. The most dramatic rise of the rest in recent history was the rise of Japan and Germany during the Cold War. American share of GDP at the end of World War II was 50%. Because of the rise of Germany and Japan, by 1969 it was 25%. Catastrophic, right? Except that was a crucial element, I think, in the victory in the Cold War and America's success. The only nation, in my view, today that is rising, that raises a real challenge to this world order the United States supports, is the rise of China. In that regard, I welcome the rise of India, because India is a natural check on China. I welcome the rise of Turkey, because I think Turkey remains fundamentally interested in furthering the goals of this world order. So, in my view, most of the rise of the rest is additive to the American position.
Of course, Japan and Germany were far more deferential to U.S. leadership than any of these countries that you just mentioned.
Well, I don't think deference to American leadership is the mark of American power and influence. I'm willing to put up with much more independent democratic nations pursuing their own policies because I still think they are contributing to the overall world order from which the United States benefits.
Okay.
And by the way, there were many European allies during the Cold War who were not exactly following the American script, and our dear friends, the French, would be the first to remind us of that.
That's true. That's true. I have an idea that what you say about China is one of the most provocative points of your argument, and I want to bring Richard in specifically on that point. You pay attention a lot to China and the so-called pivot to Asia that this administration is now committed to pursuing. What are your thoughts about what Robert has just been saying with respect specifically to China?
Well, I agree that China poses the most profound challenge that we're going to face in terms of the rising of these new powers. And I also agree that the rise of countries like India is good for the United States, even if they are not tightly aligned with the United States, because they provide a balance to the rise of China. And the question that we're going to face as a country is, how do we deal with these rising powers like China, like Turkey, like Brazil, like Indonesia, like India, in order to have a balance of power that frames the environment into which China continues to rise. In terms of the pivot specifically, there's been plenty of people that have quibbled with this term pivot because, the United States has truly never left Asia. So is that the right term? I think there's some reason to question that. But I would point out that it's a goal rather than something that the United States or the President or the State Department can hand down by fiat. And a perfect example of this, I think, was yesterday when President Obama and Prime Minister Cameron were in the Rose Garden doing their joint press conference. There were, I think, 4 questions that the press asked and a number of points that raised both sides. These are 2 key allies that have global ambitions. Not a single point was on East Asia. It was on Syria, it was on Iran, it was on Afghanistan, it was on the global economy. And so the United States is going to have to pivot to Asia in the sense that it puts more resources to bear and spends more diplomatic attention, but it can't come entirely at the expense of what's going to happen in the Middle East and in South Asia as well, because no matter how much we might want to focus on Asia and deal exclusively with China, these other things are still going to be in the forefront of our minds.
Yeah. How about, Robert, if I just finish with this, and then you sort of mentally, think of things you want to say in response to points that they've made. Tom Donnelly, Robert makes this eloquent point about the importance of consensus and continuity in looking at American foreign policy over the last 60 years, and the fact that through all of the financial and political turbulence that we've had, the changes of administration, America's position in the world has been remarkably consistent. I want to put the same question to you that I put to him. If that is the case, what does that say about presidential leadership? What does that say about the conduct of foreign policy? Does it suggest that the choices that we have made are less consequential perhaps than they seemed at the time, and the choices that we have yet to make similarly, are they perhaps less consequential than they appear right now?
Well, I would agree that there are habits and traditions and legacies, if you will, that transcend any president, any particular administration. It's really hard to, change a foreign policy tradition or a strategic tradition as strong and as successful as ours has been. So I think there's something to what you say. It's accommodated all kinds of personalities as president, and obviously parties with very different agendas. I think the thing that would be worrisome to me, and I'd be interested to hear draw Bob out on, is whether there are underlying structural things that are changing the perceptions of, and changing the effect that our domestic debate has on our ability to play the role that we have constantly played. And just to sort of put it in shorthand terms, is whether we can become a social democracy that's spending, it seems imminent, 20 to 25% of our gross domestic product on what we call entitlements programs or mandatory spending, and also debt service. Whether that doesn't really, as is obviously having the effect on our defense budgets, but whether over the course of time that kind of shifting of governmental priorities will, once the impulse reasserts itself, mean that the means to, sort of return to a more traditional leading from the front kind of American leadership will be just, very, very difficult. Just to listen, we don't see a Democratic Party debate, obviously, because they have an incumbent president, but in talking to the Republican politicians who've been elected in the 2010 election and seeing the presidential campaign, if you have, we at AEI had what was allegedly a foreign policy debate sponsored earlier in the campaign season, and it immediately turned into a budget debate, and a budget cutting debate. So, I wonder whether those kinds of concerns are really going to constrain a future president who might decide to assert a more traditional form of American leadership.
Well, it seems to me that we've had at least a couple moments in the last 60 years when there really were quite abrupt changes in the international situation. One would be the aftermath of the Vietnam War. I mean, both of these had profound implications for U.S. policy, and then the other would be the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and the rapid decline in defense spending that occurred in the aftermath of that. And yet, I think Bob makes a compelling point that through both of those watershed periods, there was actually a surprising amount of consistency. We're now facing a situation where we have U.S. forces have been in close combat in two ground wars for more than 10 years now. There was an interesting op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday from General Robert Scales quoting Lord Moran from Anatomy of Courage, a book about combat stress in World War I, where he wrote that the reservoir of courage begins to empty after the first shot is fired. The horrors of intimate killing, along with other factors such as fatigue, thirst, hunger, isolation, fear of the unknown, and the sight of dead and maimed comrades, all start a process of moral atrophy that cannot be reversed. So I think we have to look at these issues now in the context of having fought 10 really difficult years in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm wondering, Peter, what you think the implications of the last 10 years of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan mean for this debate, this discussion that we're having.
I would make two sort of points on this. And first of all, I want to thank everybody for, particularly Tom for arranging this here at AEI, and Bob for doing this, and Tom for moderating. And we're webcasting this on CNN.com, which we'll be doing over the next 3 events. I just wanted to mention that. You know, in 1968, we spent 9.5% of GDP on the Vietnam War. Right now, I mean, as a matter of the budget, it's relatively small. I'm sitting next to one of the great experts on the subject. We're only spending 1% of GDP in Afghanistan, you know. So as sort of a historical matter, we're not actually spending very much money on these wars. Point one. Point two, sort of agreeing with both Bob and yourself, Tom, and I hate to be, we're all in violent agreement. I mean, and in fact, you've undercut intellectually the whole point of this exercise, because essentially you've pointed out that it doesn't really make a difference who's the next president, because essentially these policies will continue. I mean, just as a factual matter, President Obama, who came in on an anti-war ticket, in 2011 was involved in 6 conflicts in Muslim countries, essentially. An undeclared war in Yemen, an undeclared war in Somalia, a kind of war that was winding down in Iraq. He quintupled the number of drone strikes over President Bush in Pakistan. He tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan. He said, by the way, they're going to stay there for 5 years. So not only was this continuity with George Bush, it was actually an amplification. And in fact, when we pull the troops out of Afghanistan in 2014, we're going to have the same number of troops in Afghanistan, I think, that we had at the end of George W. Bush's 8-year term. So it's not only continuity, it's an actual amplification in a sense.
Mm-hmm. But the question is whether, looking ahead,
yeah.
I mean, we're now looking at getting out of Afghanistan just as quickly as we possibly can, it seems to me.
I'm extraordinarily skeptical of that. I mean, I think, yes, there is that discussion, but I mean, look, the Status of Forces agreement that we're going to do with the Afghans is going to leave 25,000 Americans there in some shape or form. They won't all be combat troops, obviously, but it's not the same situation as Iraq. It doesn't matter who's in the White House in 2012. We've already abandoned Afghanistan twice. It's well known. In '89, we closed our embassy. In 2001, 2002, we did it on the cheap. No American president's going to do that again.
Well, I seem to be failing in my effort to prove disagreement.
I'm happy to throw a quick hand grenade.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's not the case that, I mean, part of the point of Bob Scales' article is that because the professional force is so small, a very small percentage of us have been doing the actual fighting.
Right.
It's true that there has been an ebbing of political enthusiasm for these wars. But the question is, you know, again, to go to this sort of means, resources, which are changing sort of unconscious, you know, without actual decisions being made, except in absentia, you know, whether absent some hard choices made to rebuild the means of power, and particularly hard military power, whether this world order that Bob describes, you know, will run itself, or you know, whether you can, you know, what it would look like to share the load, so to speak, in a way that fundamentally changes the role that the United States has played.
Well, I think that is the point, Bob. I mean, has there been any period in the last 60 years where we have had such a debate over the fiscal constraints that this government faces as we have right now? And you know, you make the point that defense spending shouldn't necessarily be the focus of that debate. Nevertheless, it has introduced a new element, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, I in the interest of not emphasizing continuity, I won't emphasize this point too much, but as I recall, the debate over the defense budget during the Reagan years was greater than it has been up until about a year ago. I actually used to make the point that I was somewhat astonished how little the U.S. defense budget, which was creeping up towards $700 billion a year, was the subject of political debate in the United States when Reagan's defense budgets were a major Democratic Party platform for much of those years. Now, of course, things are more like what you're saying because of the fiscal crisis, and I think that we are capable as a nation, because we have done it in the past, of cutting our defense capabilities and getting to the point where we have weakened our ability to shape the international system and brought ourselves to a potentially perilous point even in conflicts that we may get ourselves into, because we have a way of getting ourselves into conflicts even when we don't think we're ever going to do that again. So we are capable of doing that. The only thing that I would say is, if history is a guide, and that's always the good question, is history a guide? If history is a guide, something else will happen in the world which will send us in another direction. The 1990s trend was toward ever-declining defense budgets. I mean, we were getting close to it wasn't that dramatic a cut, by the way. I mean, to go down to 3% of GDP, I don't know what that was at the time. We were only spending $400 billion a year on defense, or whatever that number was at the time. And then, of course, something happened in 2001, which then led to this explosion. That's not the first time that's happened. And so there is a kind of cyclical quality to this. But and it's an interesting question about having been in war for so long. My son, who is 13 years old, said to me not long ago, "Has there ever been a time when America was not at war?" Well, you know, when I grew up, we were mostly not at war. For much of my life, we were mostly not at war. And that's an extraordinary thing. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know where that leads, because I also know that there's a whole generation of young people for whom September 11th was a defining moment. Many of them have gone into the military. People you wouldn't expect to go into the military go into the military. They go into international relations fields. They go into, that in a sense. So has this conflictual period we've been in created a real sort of fundamental weariness with it, or has it brought people back to the realization that the world's a dangerous place and the United States has to do something? And I would say Peter's point about where Barack Obama has been as president is really maybe the most compelling point. If ever there was a time when the world thought America is done with this intervention business, they thought it was the election of Barack Obama. And I get to tell this joke that what you say, which is that people told me if I voted for John McCain, we'd attack another Arab country and overthrow another Muslim dictator, and they were right. I voted for John McCain, and that's exactly what happened. So although, yes, I think there can be a tipping point, I think it's more likely that we will tip in a dangerous direction and then go through another cycle where we move up again.
Well, and I also got the feeling that you and Richard were on the same page, and Richard, I took your comments to mean that this pivot toward Asia at this point may be sort of more words than reality, since we still have an awful lot to deal with in the Middle East. And I think that...
By the way, I would also pick a fight with the pivot if you want me to.
Yeah.
If you want,
there we go.
In the interest of picking a fight, I mean, I don't want to get in the way. If Richard wants, you want to ask Richard his question first.
No, it wasn't a question. I was just sort of...
I mean, I'm very dubious about this pivot, because your point being a kind of, you're thinking as an Asianist, your point is that, well, we never really left. But the point that is made, say, in Europe and the Middle East to some extent is, if you're pivoting towards something, that means you must be pivoting away from something else. And the conference organizers in Europe are having a field day with what does the American pivot mean for Europe. That is the subject of every conference in Europe right now. And I think that it is a mistake for a nation of America's global responsibility to talk about pivoting anywhere. We can't pivot. Our interests remain very much in Europe. Our interests remain we're not leaving the Middle East, as you rightly pointed out. That we need to increase our attention to Asia, certainly in terms of our capabilities, I think is true, but there's a kind of misunderstanding of our role in the world to even talk about pivoting in one direction or another.
I have a question that I want to pose to all of you, and you just confessed to having voted for John McCain, so you're going to have to defend Senator McCain's position right here. He had Leon Panetta up on the Hill last week talking about Syria. And Leon Panetta said, as Secretary of Defense, before I recommend that we put our sons and daughters in uniform in harm's way, I've got to make very sure we know what the mission is. I've got to make very sure we all know whether we can achieve that mission, at what price, and whether or not it will make matters better or worse. To which Senator McCain responded, well, let me tell you what's wrong with your statement. You don't mention America's leadership. Americans should lead in this. America should be standing up. America should be building coalitions. We're not leading, Mr. Secretary. So Syria is a case in point where we can sort of play out, you know, what does the idea of American leadership mean in the context of a very difficult policy conundrum like Syria presents right now?
I'm going to hear what you say first.
Well, just also to push a point that Bob made. I mean, what's sort of, and to go back to my original obsession with domestic politics, you don't hear American politicians of any party talking about how the international system fits together. I mean, everything is now sort of done on a retail each's basis. And even Libya and even the dialogue about Syria is so much about the humanitarian aspect, of which is compelling and absolutely real. But if you sort of charted out a great strategic opportunity to, you know, if you're worried about the largest problem in the Middle East, Iran, and Iran with a nuclear weapon, you know, this is a tailor-made issue to use as a prism for a larger understanding of America's role in the world. And it just, again, seems to me that there is almost no conversation anywhere on the political spectrum about this. Look, I mean, everybody in the region certainly intuits that and grasps that. In fact, a lot of the rest of the world, again, it's one of those moments where, you know, we may be defining for ourselves, you know, defining American leadership downward to sort of channel, you know, Charles Murray in this regard. You know, so there are the issues of Syria in and of itself, but it is not a dispositive, but it's, you know, fact or data point, but it's a, you know, I worry that it would be a leading edge indicator of America that's sort of in this contraction mode, particularly across the Middle East.
What would be? If the U.S. were to
Look,
what?
I mean, if you sort of, there's a whole series of events. There's, just to be, you know, slightly leading west, there's the withdrawal from Iraq. There's the, as you suggested earlier, who knows exactly where the Afghanistan drawdown will end and what the pace will be. But the message has been, even since the announcement of the Obama surge, that time is limited and we're not going to commit as much as we really thought was adequate to do the job in a timely fashion. You know, our role in the Arab Spring and in the Egyptian revolution is, you know, you can look at that in a multiplicity of ways. Our inability to really decisively constrain the Iranian nuclear program can go on and on. It's a region that's in fundamental, you know, that does seem like it's at a moment of deflection in its own politics. And Americans have been working for this moment, you know, when a whole generation of autocrats is, you know, losing their grip on their own people. You know, this ought to be a huge opportunity for us to seize. And again, the overarching message, at least, you know, sometimes appears to be of, no, we want to back off. We want to be offshore balancers and do this from a distance without getting involved in these messy situations.
Do you agree with that? That's the overarching message, Peter? And what do you think American leadership means in this context?
I mean, this is sort of just a comment. It took 2 years for President Clinton to intervene in Bosnia. It took 9 days for President Obama to intervene in Libya. And why did he intervene? Well, in the 60-year of the history of the Arab League, a sort of toothless talking shop, it actually did something almost surprising itself, which was saying, essentially allowing giving the intellectual framework to allow the UN resolution, to allow NATO to go and do something. Now, what's different in Syria? I mean, there's a UN problem. I mean, I think that, and clearly that's something the Obama administration has been trying to deal with. But you've got two countries which are vetoing this kind of, any kind of operation in Syria. I think that will change. I think it's possible that China may, if the resolution is reworded or somehow, that, I mean, clearly there are people working on this to make this happen. I think there are different, I'm not an expert on the Syrian military, but I think it's a little bit more of a formidable force than the kind of essentially, the Libyan auxiliaries who are from other African countries. So, the burden is also, like, it's easy to say that we should do something, but what is it that we should be doing beyond, what are we talking about? A naval blockade? Are we talking about a no-fly zone? The devil is sort of in the details.
So, Bob, what does American leadership mean with respect to what to do in Syria?
Well, I think that in a way, if we were not in this phase of the election season, if we were in the first year, let's say, of Obama's second term, or we were 2 years ago and we hadn't done Libya, I think we might be moving very quickly toward military action in Syria. These circumstances, the circumstances are everything. I think the president does not think that the American people want another military intervention now, and he's not going to do it before the election. Now, he may not do it after the election either, because he's got Iran on his mind as well, I'm sure. And I don't rule out the possibility the president will, if he's reelected, may use force against Iran. So that's part of the calculation as well. But I don't think we would be having these tortured conversations about our inability to do anything in Syria. What I find amusing about the current discussion is that people like, I saw Senator Corker say, this isn't obviously easy like Libya. I remember somehow during the lead up to the Libya operation that everybody was saying, that was impossible. Who's this opposition? What can we possibly do militarily? Now, I don't doubt, of course the Syrian military is stronger, but I would guess that our capacity to create a safe zone, if we wanted to, and carve it out in Syria using air power is something that we could do. But I think that the president is just not in the frame to do it. And I do think it's worth, in terms of the cosmic meaning of this, I think we shouldn't overstate it. As unhappy as I am, I suffered miserably through the Clinton years when they wouldn't do certain things, and then ultimately 2 years later than necessary, they did it. By the way, the Clinton administration, I remember my favorite line in the Clinton administration is a quote from Samantha Power's book when she asked Anthony Lake why they didn't do anything about Rwanda. He said, well, we were too busy with Bosnia. And the question is, busy doing what? But this isn't the first administration to have a feeling that they're not eager to get into this. I think that the trajectory they are on is that they're ultimately going to intervene. I actually believe. If a president doesn't want to intervene, he really shouldn't say Assad must go. That's the kind of rhetoric that ultimately leads to action. Now, as I say, because of the peculiar circumstances of the timing, we may not get action when we want it.
And it gets more difficult the longer you wait, I think, too.
Well, it gets more costly because a lot more lives have been lost in the interim.
I just
Richard.
I'm a little more skeptical maybe than you two about the idea that we will intervene in Syria. I think the circumstances in Libya, my reading of that was the Europeans were so far out in front. The British and the French wanted to do something. They wanted to do a no-fly zone. The Arab League had called for it. There was going to be a resolution at the United Nations Security Council. The president said, well, everybody's telling me that no-fly zone is not going to matter much. If we're going to do this, we need to do it the right way. You had these stars aligned, and in the backdrop of all this, you had the sense that if Gaddafi was able to stop this revolt in its tracks, and that was going to have a bleed-over effect for the rest of the Arab Spring. I don't see that you have a very serious humanitarian tragedy going on every single day in Syria. But in terms of the diplomatic overlay with the Europeans, with the UN Security Council, I think even if you're able to get a UN Security Council resolution that Russia and China will sign on to, it certainly will not authorize military force the way that the resolution did in Libya. And so the administration then will be in the situation of having to either do basically what it's doing now or do some kind of military intervention, probably without UN Security Council resolution and without Arab League. Maybe the Arab League will come around, but without Arab League endorsement, I'm skeptical that they will.
Just quick footnote. The military aspect of this smells to me a little bit more like an excuse than an explanation. I mean, the Syrians haven't shot down an Israeli airplane in decades, if ever. It's stronger than the Libyan mob, but that is a very low threshold. You know, how the conflict would end and where this would all lead are really great questions. But, you know, the conventional Syrian military is just the kind of target that our high-tech forces would love. I mean, are certainly completely capable of wreaking incredible devastation upon.
And one more footnote on this. I mean, you know, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is in Syria, and it wasn't in Libya. So, I mean, they are part of the opposition in a way that obviously we need to be careful of.
And they played a very important, they had a whole recruiting infrastructure in Syria, didn't
Right,
they?
that was where all the suicide bombers transferred through Syria.
Right, yeah. This has been an interesting discussion. I do want to raise one other issue before I turn it over to you folks. And Bob, you'll have to tell me, because I didn't make it all the way through your book, if you talk here much about education, because...
No, you didn't miss anything.
I didn't think so. I didn't think so. I think this...
You don't have to read the rest of it.
No, there's plenty more in there. But I'm going to just ask if that maybe is not a weak point in your analysis, because America's educational decline is pretty clear relative to the educational attainment in other countries. And isn't that a very important part of America's strength? And if America's educational performance is declining relative to some of the other advanced countries, isn't that a worrisome development?
It is a worrisome development, but I think that, I mean, you know, I'm not an expert on education. That's why it's not in the book. You know, I only pretend to be an expert about some things. I don't pretend to be an expert about everything. But my sense about the American education system is that it's a mixed picture. On the one hand, we have the best universities in the world that everyone in the world is trying to get into. And so at the level of higher education, I think the United States is way ahead of the rest of the world. You know, European higher education's in crisis now, and I'm not sure that people are really yet dying to go to the Chinese universities. So
the Chinese are coming to our universities, and then they're going back home.
Well, I don't mind that. I mean, that's the way life is. But there's also a lot of people coming and staying. Now, and again, this is very anecdotal, but some parts of the American secondary education system in high schools are very high, precisely because the immigration here is so great. The local high school where my kids go to school has a huge stream of Asian immigrants coming in who are driving up standards like crazy and making it very hard for the rest of us to compete. But in any case, the overall level is extremely high. Now, I think that there are big gaps, obviously, in the American educational system, and you know, some places are doing extraordinarily well, and I would say doing as well as anybody in the world. But then there are many others that aren't. So, but I don't want to evade your question. Of course, we need to improve our educational system to stay competitive. We're in an information age. We're in a symbol manipulation economy. As it happens, I think the United States is still at the forefront of that kind of economy, but you can lose your place. There's no question about it.
I mean, we have focused primarily on wars and foreign engagements in this discussion so far, but you make very clear that when you talk about power, you're talking about comprehensive national power in the Chinese term.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts before we...
Well, I just hate this comprehensive national power thing. It's true. I mean, you know, it makes perfect sense. But some of these things are better tools of statecraft than others. I mean, this whole soft power, you know, sticky power, gooey power. You know, it's all important. But you know, you can't sort of order American culture around the way you can order the American military around. And if you can order the American economy around, but that tends to have more downside consequences than upside consequences. You know, it's like our whole conversation about power and statecraft has become sort of, you know, debased in some way. That's what I actually like about Bob's book, is he tends to concentrate on putting, you know, when he talks about the international order, it's clear that what's underlying it is a security architecture that enables all the other good things. And you wouldn't discount the value of American political beliefs or American culture, high, low, middle, or anything. But making the world safe for rap music is
Well, let me
important
illustrate that quickly. I mean, I think that's a good point that Tom's making, and there's a little easy capsule illustration of that. Over the past 2 years, at a time when the American economy has been in terrible shape and the Chinese economy has been very successful and soaring, and all these elements that we are worried about have existed. But if you asked, I think, anybody looking at the diplomatic and geostrategic score sheet, who has done worse over the last 2 years, it's actually China. By overplaying their hand in the South China Sea, they have resurrected the American position in Asia. They've got everybody in the region, including Southeast Asians who were never that enamored of the American relationship, now coming to the United States. China is a net loser so far, in that they may change. The other thing is, look at what's going on in the international system in terms of Syria and Libya and Iran. China has been forced again and again into positions that they would not otherwise take. China is not in the business of helping democracies overthrow other autocracies, and yet they have been forced into this position by a combination of the United States and Europe and the Arab League. So, for all of our weakness in GDP and education and the other things, at the level of grand politics, it's still the case that we wield a lot of influence.
Well, you say China's been a net loser, but I think you could make an argument that Europe hasn't done too well in the last couple of years either.
I didn't write a book about how Europe's not in decline.
No, but you did.
I would be willing to make the case.
But you did say that the rise of the rest has come not at the expense of U.S. power, but you did say it has come at the expense of European power.
Right, although I'm still optimistic about Europe.
Okay, all right. Let's open it up to the audience now, and I'm thinking we probably have microphones, right? Yeah, we have microphones all over the place.
Just admin-wise, please follow the AEI 3 rules. Wait for the microphone, state your name for the purposes of the transcript, and make your statement in the form of a question.
You, sir, I think you were the first to raise your hand here, right in the front row. He's coming.
Thanks. Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report. I want to offer a point of view for Bob Kagan to respond to, and it goes like this. It's about the continuity of American foreign policy argument. The point of view is that from post-World War II, perhaps even before, to the present day, for much of that time, the differences on American foreign policy were sort of easily described as hawks and doves or terms of that sort that tended to be more a reflection of party affiliation. That at some point, and I'm not sure where, I'm also not sure whether this thesis is right, but I'm offering it, at some point that has shifted. And we're not so much in the hawks versus doves anymore, but perspectives about kinetic initiatives taken by this government have more to do with ins and outs. So
are you asking Bob if he agrees with that?
Yeah, I'm asking him whether that is an accurate assessment. In other words, in Kosovo, Clinton wanted to do it, and suddenly the Republicans were against it. Somewhat the same situation pertained in Libya. So my first question is that remotely accurate? And if it is, what has made that transition? And B, how does that augur for the likelihood of continuity moving forward?
Well, I think that it has generally been true throughout American history that the ins were activist and the outs were anti-activist, because, and it makes a certain amount of sense. The president in our Constitution wields enormous power and influence in foreign policy, and Congress is really about stopping. And even in the early part of the Cold War, after all, When the Democrats were in power, the Republicans were fundamentally isolationist, and the Democrats were the hawks. And that basically persisted until the Democratic crack-up in the Vietnam War. But of course, the real turn to being opposed to war came only after Nixon was elected, right? It didn't quite finish during the time when the Democrats were in power. So there's a certain continuity there, I think, which is still true. There is a general continuity throughout the history of American foreign policy that what I would call, and this isn't always true either, but it's been true, the more progressive of the two parties domestically has also tended to be more progressive in their global approach. Just as an illustration, at the end of the 1890s, the conservative party were the Democrats because they were still the party of the South to some extent. And they were the more isolationist of the two parties, while the Republicans, who were the progressive party, were the more internationalist. And you can see that flipping and flopping. It flips. Woodrow Wilson becomes the progressive, changes the party, becomes a progressive internationalist, and Republicans go back to being conservative and isolationist in the 20s. So, sorry, more than you wanted.
My name is Trevor Gowan from the United Nations Washington office. Thank you for your talk today, first of all. I was wanted to ask the panel what they view the role of the international community, specifically current American partners and the United Nations, moving forward in Afghanistan post-2014. Thank you.
Well, I think NATO has already made it clear that it will be in Afghanistan after 2014, and in May we're going to have a NATO conference, which in Chicago summit meeting, which I think is. I think the hope was that there will be an announcement of a strategic forces agreement with Afghanistan and the United States. One of the big impediments to that has just gone away, which is the question of will the Afghan government be able to handle get Afghan detainees, prisoners, into their prison system, and the answer now to that is basically yes. So, the international community has a good reason to be involved in Afghanistan going forward. We're still in Okinawa 6 decades after World War II, so I don't think we're going to be leaving the place where we were attacked from only a decade ago. It's the right thing to do. Afghans are very concerned. Tom alluded to this. We've sent a lot of mixed messages about when we're leaving. Every time it looks like we're heading to the exits, it causes a lot of consternation. So I think that if the message comes out of Chicago that we plan to have a long-term partnership, and it's also a NATO partnership, that is a very desirable thing, because that will affect the hedging strategies of Pakistan and every other country that surrounds Afghanistan, making it clear that we will be there.
Wild card, which is that we may have a brand new French government taking office just days before the NATO summit, who may not feel like swallowing whatever the last policy was. I've been warned about that, but maybe we won't. So.
My name is Hugh Grindstaff, THAS for Diplomats. Before General Scales came out with his editorial, I was thinking we have Vietnamization of the troops in Afghanistan.
We have what?
Vietnamization.
Vietnamization.
Because you see 10 years of fatigue, you see people who are there sacrificing their lives. The local population is really not into their being there. The whole consequence of how their families are struggling back home, when Kim Kardashian makes $10,000 just by opening her mouth. They're struggling to make, it's the psychological effect on these guys is tremendous. And none of us in this room, except for the guys who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan, can attest to it. So how are we going to deal with this troop fatigue?
Okay, Tom.
Look, I think it's worth thinking very hard about this. And not leaping to conclusions from anecdotes. Although it is true that the stress and suicide statistics and things like that, it's very worrisome. But for us sort of military geeks, if you step back from the headlines of the day, it's remarkable how well the force has sustained this. We should never take this for granted. But if you'd said to me, or I think to a lot of students at military affairs on September 10th, here's what's going to come for the next 10 years, people would have said, oh my God, the force will break. Well, again, you don't know where the cliff is until you kind of fall off it, to be sure. But the performance of this force has been above and beyond, and that includes the reserve components that have played a huge role in this. So, you know, it's something that's worth watching and being sensitive to, and it would be nice if our politicians actually encouraged people not just to be thankful for the sacrifices, but encourage people to share the burdens as well. You know, it's one thing to bake folks a casserole, another thing to, you know, to sign up or to support the force. So, I mean, it's drawing a policy conclusion from anecdotes when, given what they've gone through, the discipline of the force has been just astounding by any historical or measurement that we would have.
That's a good point.
Thank you. Francois Béjean, Catalyst Partners. A good friend of mine who's kind of the Andy Marshall in NATO talks a lot about the need for a gentle giant, and that we're it. There is no one else, and probably will never be anyone. And I remember Jim Morehouse, who was the commercial attaché in Paris about 20 years ago, who would remind me that Commerce Department wears brown shoes and State Department wears black shoes, and he had all kinds of messages, but one of those was that it's not just commerce that determines our foreign policy. There's just a different dimension, and you've been talking about it. Well, with that in mind, after the 9/11, all the focus naturally moved to the Middle East. Nothing was said today at all about Central and South America, and yet it's our next door neighbor. And so we went to Europe to help them time and time again when they get in trouble. But are we really watching? And I guess the bigger question is, can we afford to be that gentle giant and have some sort of a balance? And I'm talking both under the previous administration and this administration, where there was one, you know, friendly meeting with the president of Mexico with Bush 43, and then 9/11 happened, and that was it. And so are we able to keep having that balance and looking at all the areas of the world?
Okay, I'm going to do a real quick search, see about what you say about Latin America.
Nope, it's not in there. It's 130 text pages.
Here it is.
So if I'd written all this stuff, no one would have ever read this book. No, but it's a very important point. It's not a joking matter, except that I will tell this joke, which is that the famous line for a very long time has been, the United States will do everything about Latin America except think about it. I mean, you know, it's just, it's a recurring theme. You could have gotten up any time in the last 100 years and said, shouldn't the United States be paying more attention to Latin America? We'll invade it more easily than we'll pay attention to it. So that's been one problem. Now, and I think the answer to your question is certainly yes. There needs to be more attention, and we really ought to be able to walk and chew gum and pay attention to Latin America at the same time. It's not that demanding. All that having been said, however, things in Latin America are not that bad in historical terms. I would say things in Central America are quite bad. Mexico is seriously bad, but there are some very positive elements about Latin America today, including the continuing relative success of democracies. You have the rise of a global power in Latin America, which is, you know, that hasn't been true for a while. And there are a lot of things moving in a hopeful direction. Colombia has moved in a very hopeful direction, with American assistance, by the way, I think very helpfully. I think the American approach in 2 administrations to Chavez, which is basically to ignore him, has been more or less successful. That doesn't mean there aren't a lot of problems. I was very happy to see the Obama administration get those trade agreements through. They're actually more of benefit to us than they are to them, but they were a symbolic commitment to the region. And I would say that don't underestimate the degree to which Latin America benefits to some degree from a certain amount of American neglect. Because when we do get heavily involved in Latin America, we tend to be Bigfoot a little bit, right? So it's a careful balance. I'm in fundamental agreement with you, but I still feel like things aren't so bad as they could be in the region.
How about someone over on you, ma'am? Right here.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang, independent TV program producers. I think about the national security, and you mentioned democracy, education, but I think there's some inconsistency in a propaganda sense that America is not doing right. So I wonder if you can address even more. For instance, Eisenhower say industrial complex of the defense is bad for our nation, but we ignore that. And you know that Obama is at the beginning is anti-war, but continue to fight and continue to detain prisoners without charge. And education, you're talking about a PhD, probably should be used to the higher position, but many PhD, they are unemployment or become janitors. I just wonder if we can address all these inconsistencies so we can move forward. And we should be war against injustice here inside domestically rather than against humanity overseas.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure there's as much inconsistency as you're suggesting, but first of all, I thought, you know, among the many things that I didn't like about Eisenhower, that speech is one of them. I really don't know what he was talking about. I don't think that our country is controlled by the military-industrial complex by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm not a big fan of that quotation. I do think, obviously, the United States is constantly forced to measure itself as it passes judgment on the rest of the world. There was a time when the United States was, expressing its moral disapproval of other nations while certain minorities in this country had no rights. And in a way, one of the products of the Cold War was greater pressure on the United States domestically to live up to some of its pronouncements globally. I would say there are few countries in the world that work harder to try to perfect their imperfections than the United States. Very few nations, there are some, but very few nations are more self-critical than Americans are and work harder to try to address inequities in their system. And by the way, they frequently fail. And hypocrisy is a human attribute. It's an inescapable human attribute. But my view of the United States is that we need to compare Americans to humans, not to angels. And compared to humans, I think the Americans do pretty well.
Tom.
Yeah, just apropos of the military-industrial complex and the national security state and civil liberties. I mean, can't explain it causally, but there's certainly a correlation through the Cold War between American power, or the rise of American power, and the expansion of domestic liberties at home. It was a period when, the Civil Rights Act was, beginning with Brown v. Board of Education, through women's rights and gay rights and rights. So there's, I think, and historically this is also internationally true, there is a correlation between American power and human liberty. Again, to say that it's causal, requires elaboration, but there is, compared to other world powers of ages past, going back to Bob's original point, this is not only a remarkable peaceful and prosperous era, but a remarkably free era, especially for Americans. So I would actually worry that as we become, if we are shrinking and in decline, whether we will be so expansive in, granting rights and encouraging civil liberties here at home is a question that never gets asked.
Just a quick point on the, because the United States has a human rights agenda, it will always be accused of inconsistency, both inconsistency with our values and as the way they're applied at home, and inconsistency in the way we apply our human rights agenda abroad. But consistency is not the highest good in international affairs and American foreign policy. And if we can do some things somewhere on the human rights agenda, even if we can't do them in other places, I'd rather be accused of inconsistency than accused of doing nothing.
This was intended to sort of set up the presidential election, and so this might be a good point to bring up a minor issue that has arisen in this campaign, and that is President Obama's apology to Afghanistan for the burning of the Korans, and that was immediately criticized by several of the Republican candidates. I'm wondering what any of you think American leadership, American exceptionalism, and America's claim to stand for human rights and liberty, what does that imply? What does that imply of the United States when you have a situation like this, when U.S. troops do something that is so offensive to the people you are trying to serve? Was that apology appropriate or not, sort of in this context? Peter.
I think it was very pragmatic. I mean, at the end of the day, the commander-in-chief has a responsibility to his soldiers in Afghanistan, and that was a way to kind of reduce the kind of tension in the country. Clearly, that was his primary intent. The other observation is, as the world's only superpower, I think occasionally we can apologize without it being a problem. I mean, to what constituency? How does that sort of damage us? I find it incomprehensible, particularly when an apology is needed. And a sort of sub-point on this, on November 26th, we killed 24 Pakistani soldiers. And there's an investigation on both sides of the border about what happened. As is often the case in war, there was miscommunication on both sides. But at the end of the day, Pakistan is supposed to be one of our allies. And the fact that President Obama hasn't apologized, by the way, for that. I think that sometimes, to me, that's sort of the opposite mistake. I mean, even if it's inadvertent, it's okay to apologize, in my view.
No, I'm not really concerned about the apology in and of itself. I just worried that it's a measure of sporadic attention on the part of the president. And apropos Peter's Pakistan point, the only thing worse than having to deal with people like Hamid Karzai or the Pakistani political leadership or the Pakistani army is neglect of doing so. What I really would prefer to see is sort of more active engagement. I worry that we are not managing the people who really are our allies for better or worse, as well as we might do.
In that case, you were referring to Pakistan.
Well, both, actually. I mean, I think, I defer to Peter, but have actually a balance of, a coalition in Afghanistan that could be sustainable, but again requires a certain amount of energy to put together.
Let's go back to the audience now. There was somebody back. I'll get you right here in front.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Weingarten with the New America Foundation. Similarly, I'm kind of wondering if we can talk a little bit about the extent to which the subject of America's role in the world is kind of being talked about on the campaign trail. And I'm wondering if any of you see any of the GOP candidates as doing, I guess, a particularly good job of thinking about or kind of addressing this issue, aside from simply kind of offering reactive comments about Afghanistan and Syria.
But in a sense, the most kind of comprehensive position is Ron Powell's. I mean, it's intellectually coherent. I think that the Republican candidates have a very consistent problem, which goes to what we've discussed already, which is you can critique around the edges on Afghanistan, but at the end of the day, there were 30,000 troops in Afghanistan in 2008, and they went up to 100,000. We're drawing down this year. So what do you really say? What, we would have put 400,000 troops in, we would have stayed for decades? I mean, there's not much you can really say to critique it. And similarly with Pakistan, I mean, okay, so Obama quintupled the number of drone strikes. Should a hypothetical Republican candidate have been in office? Should they have quintupled the quintupling? I mean, so I think it's very hard to criticize somebody who's actually being quite aggressive. Similarly in Yemen, similarly in Somalia, similarly in Libya. And obviously there might be a debate about Syria, but the fact is that no one's really proposing what the Syrian military intervention would really look like, at least on the Republican candidate side.
Well, as an advisor to Governor Romney, I think he's done an excellent job. No, I mean, look, first of all, he has, in fact, laid out a very comprehensive, by far the most comprehensive approach to foreign policy. He has a very long white paper. He has given a big speech on the subject. But as is normal in the nature of most primary campaigns, it just hasn't been the topic du jour, and you don't get a chance to lay out your grand vision of American foreign policy when you're debating contraception and, and all the other important topics that they're debating. So I think you'll see more. The better time to ask this question will be in the general election, because then I think there will be a discussion about American foreign policy. I think that there has been room for criticism of the Obama administration, and I know that one of the major approaches of Governor Romney, for instance, is that for quite some time and in various parts of the world, President Obama has not been particularly great with a number of our allies, and he's now, by the way, scrambling to repair that image. This meeting with David Cameron is intended, I think, to undo the slight that was allegedly committed when he returned the bust of Winston Churchill, and he's had to work very hard to prove that he's a good friend of Israel as we're in this election cycle. But I think that there is a legitimate case to be made that in much of the administration's early outreach to adversaries and potential competitors to the United States, whether it was the reset of Russia, the outreach to Iran, inevitably some of that has come at the expense of traditional allies who may be themselves competitors and adversaries of those players. And I think that's a legitimate criticism.
Go ahead. Let's let Richard go first.
If I could just add one thing on terms of the foreign policy debate, and having worked for the presidential candidate in 2008 that didn't win, I have some insight into how these debates take shape. And this time around, quote, everybody knows that this is going to be an economy election, that foreign policy and national security issues aren't going to matter. We all here on the table have a vested interest in that not being the case. But even so, I think it has the virtue of being untrue, in the sense that both candidates are going to have to convince the voters that they are the commander-in-chief who, at the end of the day, can be trusted with preserving the national security of this country. And that's why you're going to see all kinds of speeches and activities that are trying to bolster their case for that. So even while you may see the press pay most of the attention to the economy, behind the scenes, at a minimum, you're going to see a real debate on the national security matters, and it will matter at the end of the day.
Yeah, and not to criticize the press, but at every one of these debates, the number of foreign policy questions addressed by the media as opposed to the infidelity questions addressed by the media, the ratio is, low.
One attempt to deepen and to add something of value. One way to look at this divide is not so much partisan or Hawks versus Dove, at least to me, is kind of a generational split. The biggest, differences tend to be the more, again, with Senator McCain and Senator Lieberman sort of being the sort of uber examples of this, of guys who have a pretty traditional and conventional view of foreign policy and America's role in the world, versus a whole host of younger politicians, post-Cold War generational politicians who have a much diverse and more incoherent set of foreign policy views, and as the other.
Anybody in mind? Do you have one?
Well, no, but I mean that's one. Well, okay, right and left. I mean, again, I think there are different. The point is that they have not congealed around as much around the consistencies and traditional habits and it's been some time now. In many ways, this is, I would think, a continuity of the things that we saw during the Clinton years for a whole host of reasons.
The Center for New American Security. This is very much a follow-on question, and all of the panelists have addressed this in part, but not explicitly. What exactly are the top 1, 2, or 3 defining issues that will define how the national security election should be determined? Granted that global role, leadership are the key overarching issues, but how will that come down in terms of 1, 2, or 3 issues?
Let's just quickly go down the line here.
Well, any president has to deal with the cards that have been dealt, and the cards that have been dealt this president and the next president are what's happening in the Arab world. I would say the most substantial event of our current period is the Arab awakening, the Arab Spring, or whatever you want to call it, because however it shakes out is going to reshape that part of the world, which remains a very important part of the world. And so I would say managing as best we can, with understanding the limitations of our ability to manage it, it ought to be at least in the top two. I do think that how the United States, you're saying beyond the level of global leadership, but I do think the defense budget, given the sequestration issue and the potential damage of it, really needs to be way up there. I'll let others add more.
I would put Iran first, and because I think that the candidates will draw a distinction on their approach to preventing Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon, then the war in Afghanistan and how they might, even if it's a marginal, even the debate is on the margins, that will be an element in the debate because we're seeing so much in the news on this. And then third, I would agree that the Middle East and the way that the Middle East is headed.
Richard, do you an issue? I mean, some people have predicted that China is going to be a big issue in trade, certainly in the context of trade difficulties and so forth.
It will be an issue. Maybe if I had 4 rather than 3, I would put China as number 4. But in terms of the content of the debate and everything, I would put that behind those 3.
Well, the 4 big issues are the 4 big issues that we're addressing in our series. So anybody who deviates from that is, out of the triumvirate. Yeah, write that down. But look, I mean, I go back to the title of Bob's book. We're living in a world that we made, and nobody could unmake it or change it more than we can, for better or worse. All these, I think in sort of, historical terms, all the challenges that are out there are relatively manageable, compared to, say, Napoleonic France or the rise of Germany or something like that. There's many better reasons to think for a good outcome in regard to China. And there are many problems in the Middle East, and the Iranian nuclear one could be a transformative one that, sort of shift this collection of issues that we've been able to manage into something, sort of that gets out of hand. But there doesn't seem to me to be anything that's beyond our ability, particularly because we're starting from such a position of inherent strength and have had a century's worth of success in establishing this world. So, that's why we kind of wanted to start with this framing issue.
5 years ago, if we'd had this panel, the first answer would have been Al-Qaeda and jihadi terrorism. We haven't even discussed that today, essentially. So, because Al-Qaeda is essentially basically out of business. So, and since that's my area of professional expertise, I have every reason to not. It's like being a Sovietologist in 1989. I need to find something else. So, but in terms of, I think something that we tend to sort of forget in these discussions is, Pakistan is going to be the 5th largest country in the world. It has the fastest growing nuclear program. It will have more nuclear weapons than Britain may already have already. Managing our relationship with Pakistan is incredibly important. It's obviously a very difficult one. And one of the more predictable foreign policy challenges of President Obama or President Romney or whoever is president in the next several years is sort of a Mumbai 2, by which I mean an attack on India that provoked the idea that terrorists can buy or acquire nuclear weapons is in the area of fantasy. What is not in the area of fantasy is a terrorist triggering a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. India exercised a great deal of restraint after the Mumbai 2008 attacks. The Indian government would find it hard not to do something with a similar kind of attack in the future. Pakistan has tactical nuclear weapons, so you can sort of sketch out the scenario. That is a major foreign policy challenge that any president will have to be thinking about very carefully in the future.
Hi there, Tucker Huth. I'm interning at the Cato Institute. My question is really about the nature of diplomacy. Now that we, as you saw through the 2000s, kind of the rise of stateless violence, Al-Qaeda and whatnot, and also Obama's massive escalation of drone warfare. I think in the day of the nuclear age, we were almost hyper-diplomatic because that was the great fear. But in a day where you're not necessarily talking to nation states, and also state violence can become much more anonymous in the sense of drone warfare, and anybody can really be attacked by anybody, it seems. A much big leveling of the playing field. How does that change our diplomatic priorities? First of all, we saw Obama attack in Pakistan, without contacting the states first. So it seems like diplomacy might be taking a back end to simply American policy. Is this a tendency you notice, or do you share these anxieties about the future of diplomacy?
It's a really interesting question. With or diplomacy?
H or not an H. The new complexion of the international system is something that we've been talking about for well over a decade. And without minimizing the issues that you've raised, I am actually underwhelmed by how revolutionary it's all been. I find state-to-state relations remarkably relevant in the current era. I am not overwhelmed by the presence of non-state actors in the international system. We've obviously dealt with Al-Qaeda and others, and will continue to deal with them. But as I look around dealing with most of the crises that people are dealing with, they are very much about state-to-state cooperation, and that includes dealing with weapons of mass destruction, which is about cooperation among states on the high seas and detection and shared intelligence resources. That is very much about diplomacy, and so I continue to believe that diplomacy is still of the greatest value. I don't really think it's changed.
I would just point out that just today we've seen that the SWIFT organization has agreed to sanction banks, Iranian banks, and the front page of the Financial Times today had a story about Iran's oil output being at a decade low. So I think at least as far as the conflict with Iran is concerned, diplomacy is front and center.
If I could add, even on this question of drone strikes, diplomacy is critically important. You want to have drone strikes, drones have to take off from somewhere. Well, where do they take off from? Where do they fly over? Most of the time, we're dealing with foreign governments in order to secure the rights to do those sorts of things. It's the rare case in which we're just doing things unilaterally, completely on our own, without any sort of diplomatic relations with the state over which we're flying. So overflight rights, landing and bases, and intelligence cooperation, and diplomatic coordination, all of those sorts of things get at the heart of what we're doing diplomatically with countries. So even in the case of drone strikes, I think the diplomacy is critically important.
Tom, Peter, final thoughts?
Actually, everything has been said. It just hasn't been said by me. In this case, I think I'll defer. I think we've covered the landscape extraordinarily well.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. The book, Bob's book, is The World America Made. I can't believe you're not selling it here. I would never.
It's all about money, Tom.
No, it's about promoting your message. But it's very readable, very well written, very well thought out. So I'd like to thank my panelists. First of all, Bob Kagan, the author of the book, and then Peter Bergen and Tom Donnelly and Richard Fontaine from rival think tanks, as it were. I'd like to thank American Enterprise Institute for doing this, and best of luck to you, Tom, in the rest of these series. So thank you very much.